was well disguised, actually. I didn't put you on aces there.
I thought I was going to get.
Well disguised, man.
Today, I play some 1-3 at Cascades Casino in Langley. As I start the day, as you can see, it's bright and sunny. What you can't see is that it's actually quite cold, and that's just the way I like it. For the first two interesting hands, I messed up a little on the technical side. I thought I was recording, but actually wasn't. Anyways, this hand, I pick up ace-queen under the gun. I open to $10. The cutoff calls and the big blind calls. It's three-way to a flop of ace-8-9 rainbow. The big blind checks to me. Very good flop for me with the ace-high board. I c-bet for $20. Looking for value from all straight draws and weaker aces. The cutoff calls and the big blind folds. The turn is a 7 of hearts, which brings in the backdoor flush draw. I'm not too thrilled with this card. There's no flush draw on the flop, and this card completes the most obvious draw, which is 10-jack for an open-ender. I decide to be cautious and check the street. The villain bets $45. I'm not loving it because his bet really seems like it's for value, and I don't beat a lot of value hands. He can have all the 2 pairs and sets of 9s or 8s here, and of course the 10-jack that hit as well. I can still beat ace-jack and ace-10, so I call here. And at this point would be happy to get the showdown as cheaply as possible. The river is the queen of hearts. This is probably the best card I can ask for to improve my hand. It brings in the flush, but I'm not too concerned with it since I have the ace of hearts. And I was putting him on a strong hand on the turn. I still lose to this straight and sets, but I now beat all 2 pairs, which he could also easily have to bet for value. Even though my hand improved substantially, I think it's still pretty close, and I opt to go for a check call line. I check. The villain bets $75. Not too much to think about, as it was already decided. I quickly call. He shows pocket 7s for a turn set. I muck and say nice hand. This hand, I pick up pocket 10s at the middle position. There is a button straddle to $6. The small blind folds. The big blind raises to $15. Under the gun +1 calls, and I decide to cold call this one. Everyone else folds, and it's three-way to a flop of 8-9-3 with 2 diamonds. The big blind c-bets for $30. Under the gun +1 folds. I have some options here. I'm definitely not folding my overpair. I double block straight draws and unblock the diamonds, so if I raise here, it would mainly be for protection against overcards and the diamond draw, but I do want to keep his value hands in, which lose to me. You might be asking what value hands can he have for opening here? Surely not ace-9 or ace-8 in that position. Well, this is the kind of game that those exact hands will open a lot, even out of position. I call. The turn is the deuce of clubs, essentially a brick. The villain continues betting for $65. I call. The river is the 5 of clubs. The villain now checks. Even though the river card brings in a flush, I do block it with the 10 of clubs in my hand. I just have a pretty strong feeling I can go for value here against a 1-pair hand. I decide to bet $80. The villain tanks for a while and then calls. I table my hand and he mucks. I fix my camera here, and this is a peek at my stack pretty early into the session. This hand, I pick up pocket aces in the middle position. There are 2 limpers, and I raise it up to $30. The button calls, and one of the limpers call. The flop comes Jack 7-5 rainbow. Pretty good flop for aces. It checks to me, and I c-bet for $65, hoping to get value from any jack. Unfortunately, everyone folds. This hand, I pick up pocket 9s in the big blind. Everyone folds to the hijack, who limps. The cutoff and the button folds. The small blind raises to $16. I decide to cold call here, essentially set mining in position versus the pre-flop aggressor. I don't think there's ever a 3-bet coming from the hijack, and he indeed calls. It's 3-way to a flop of 10-8-8 with 2 diamonds. Everyone checks. The turn is the 5 of clubs. The small blind checks, and I now bet out $20, with what could easily be the best hand for now, and also a hand that could use some protection. The hijack folds, and the small blind calls. The river is the queen of clubs. The villain checks again. I contemplate very briefly if I need to turn this hand into a bluff, since I do double block 9-jack for the straight and 9-8 combos, but I also unblock the diamonds, which means a villain could easily have called the turn with a diamond draw, and my hand just has too much showdown value, so I check back and just table my hand. The villain shows ace high, and I take this one down. This hand, I pick up ace 9 on the button. Under the gun straddles for $6. There are 3 limpers, and I also limp. The big blind calls, and under the gun checks his option. It's 6-way to a flop of ace queen deuce with 2 hearts. Everyone checks to me. Typically, multi-way, I would be more cautious, but in a limp pot, I think my top pair with the middling kicker is in the lead most of the time. There is a flush draw out there, and I do have 1 heart blocker. I bet $15 to get value from all draws and weaker aces. Under the gun calls, and the cutoff calls. The turn is the 5 of clubs. Everyone checks to me again. The flush draw doesn't complete, and I still beat a lot of aces, so I continue to bet for value. I bet $45. Under the gun tanks for a little while here. I was half expecting him to check raise, but he ends up just calling. The cutoff folds and gets out of the way. The river is an offsuit 8. The villain checks once again. I think for a moment here if there's any merit for a value bet. Checking back and going to showdown with top pair, I think is fine. There are 2 missed flush draws on the board, but since the suits of my hand blocks both, it's slightly less likely the villain was on a flush draw. So, does he have any value hand that loses to mine is the question. On the turn, the villain took a bit of time to make a reluctant call. I feel like he has a weaker ace, but I think the turn card is something that helped him. My gut feeling is that he has ace 3 or ace 4, so he doesn't feel too great calling my bets, but picked up extra equity on the turn with a gut shot straight draw. I decide to go for a value bet that targets that hand. I bet $60. The villain tanks for a while, and then calls. We table our hands. The villain shows ace 4, and I take this one down. This hand, I'm on the button again, and I pick up jack queen. There are 4 limpers, and I also limp. The small blind folds and the big blind checks. It's 6-way to a flop of 10 jack 6 rainbow. Everyone checks to me, and I bet $15. Only the big blind and the cutoff calls. The turn is a 4 that completes the rainbow. Everyone checks to me again. I just continue betting for value with top pair. I bet $30, and everyone folds. Nothing too interesting or special about this hand, but I think this hand, and the one before, does convey the vibe of this table quite well. There is a lot of limping and multi-way unraised pots. When I'm in position, like in this hand and the previous hand, I've been over-limping quite a bit with middling hands to C-flops. For the most part, it's pretty easygoing, laid back, and nice chatting with players at the table, drawing some cards. This hand, I pick up pocket aces under the gun. I open to $10. +1 calls, hijack calls, and the big blind calls. It is 4-way to a flop of 10-8-5 with 2 clubs. The big blind checks. I c-bet for $20. +1 calls, hijack folds, big blind calls. The turn is the 9 of spades. The big blind checks again. This is not that great of a card. The club draw didn't hit, but the 9 does complete some good straight draws like jack queen or 6-7. Also, 10-9 is a possible hand here that would improve to 2 pair. So I'm now way behind a lot of value hands and probably only beating a flush draw or 10 jack and 10 queen, and slightly possible they can be loose enough to be in here with 10-7. I check to assess the action. Under the gun +1 bets out $45. The big blind folds. With an overpair and still being ahead of the few hands I mentioned, I call. I'm hoping the river goes check-check. The river is the 8 of spades. I actually think this is a great card for me. The villain's line is leaning heavily towards holding a 10. So that means he wouldn't have made a flush with spades. 10-9 just got counterfeit. So I now beat all 10x hands except for 10-8, which is not likely. I actually contemplate a value/blocker bet here, but ultimately decide to go for a check call line. I check. The villain checks back. I table my hand and he mucks. For the next couple hours, I do pick up some good starting hands. I win some small pots, lose some small pots, pretty standard stuff, but nothing too interesting. For the last interesting hand of this session, I pick up Ace-4 of diamonds in the small blind. Under the gun straddles to $6. The low jack, cutoff, and button calls. I also call. The straddler checks, and it's 5-way to a flop of King Jack 8 with 2 diamonds. We check to the cutoff, who bets $15. The button calls, and I make an easy call with the nut flush draw. Everyone else folds. The turn is the 7 of hearts. For now, there's no flush, but 9-10 gets there. I check. Everyone else also checks. The river is the 10 of diamonds, which is the gin card. I have the nut flush, but flush draw getting there is a pretty obvious line based on how this hand played out. I don't think I'll ever get called by betting big. There is a 4-liner to a straight on board. I decide to bet $30. I think this sizing will get a crying call from anyone with a 9 and could get raised by a weaker flush, which would be the dream scenario. Realistically though, I'd be happy to get one caller. The cutoff thinks for a bit and calls. The button thinks for a bit and also calls. Pretty surprising. I table my hand and they both muck. Here are the results of this session. I bought in for $700 and I cashed out for $1,060. So that is a profit of $360. And the results will be shown right here. There are a couple things that I want to share with you guys, and actually they are more like recommendations, pretty random. Maybe the first one not so much, but yeah, the first thing I want to recommend is a show called Game of Gold. And I think most of you who are watching poker vlogs probably are most likely already watching this show. So this is more for those of you who haven't come across it, haven't heard of it, or are maybe on the fence of whether or not to watch this show. Game of Gold, produced by GG Poker, is essentially a reality game show that starts with 12 contestants and they compete via poker to get eliminated down to one winner at the end. And for this season, all the contestants are poker pros. Based on that premise, you can probably tell that there's a lot of good stuff for poker fans and poker players. And while that is true, I also think that it's produced in such a way that it's a very enjoyable watch for more casual players or newcomers to the game as well, because it mixes in a lot of reality game elements like drama, and also the team competition aspect makes it very interesting and fun to watch. So I highly recommend it. The whole season is available to watch on YouTube, with the finale episode premiering this Friday. So check it out. The second thing that I wanted to recommend to you guys is a hot pot place I visited last week. I'm actually not a huge fan of hot pot in general, but this place called Round Pot in Richmond on Alexandra Road has this signature soup, which is their chicken, fish maw, and squash soup. It was just so delicious and comforting. If you are a fan like me of Chinese style homemade flavorful soup, then you guys should definitely check this place out. And that is it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you guys have been watching my vlogs and enjoying it and have not subscribed yet, I do ask that you please remember to do so. It does help the channel out a lot. I hope you guys look forward to the next.